Imagine building an empire, dedicating your entire life to creating something great, only to be forgotten. At the Grand Lexington Hotel, an old doorman stands at the entrance every day, opening doors for guests who barely acknowledge his presence. To them, he's just another employee, someone unimportant. But what they don't know is that this man isn't just a doorman. He is the true owner of the building, the mastermind behind the very empire they walk through without a second thought. And one arrogant manager, blinded by his own power, is about to learn the most humiliating lesson of his life. Because real power isn't about money or status, it's about how you treat people when you think no one is watching. This is a story you won't forget. Watch until the end and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? It was a crisp autumn afternoon in New Haven, the kind where the air smelled of damp leaves and distant salt from the harbor. The Grand Lexington Hotel, a towering masterpiece of glass and marble, loomed over Lexington Heights, its golden letters shimmering under the pale sunlight. The streets bustled with the usual rhythm of the city, horns blaring, hurried footsteps clicking against the pavement, the occasional burst of laughter from a sidewalk cafe. At the hotel entrance, the doors glided open and shut in a steady flow, revealing glimpses of a world draped in luxury. Polished floors gleaming under crystal chandeliers, bellhops in crisp uniforms moving with rehearsed precision, and guests draped in expensive coats and even more expensive attitudes. And standing at the front, always at the front, was Elias Moreau. He had been there for as long as anyone could remember. 78 years of quiet resilience, his deep brown skin weathered by time, his short silver hair barely visible under the polished black cap he wore as part of his uniform. His posture was always straight, his back refusing to bend under the weight of years. His hands, though aged, were steady, firm, hands that had once built something great, though no one here knew that. To most, Elias was invisible. He was the doorman, nothing more. A fixture of the Grand Lexington, like the gilded chandeliers or the marble columns, noticed only when needed, forgotten the second the doors swung shut behind them. But Elias? He noticed everything. He saw the executives stepping out of their black town cars, barking orders into their Bluetooth earpieces as assistants scrambled behind them. He saw the wealthy tourists arriving with an air of detachment, as if the world itself existed to cater to them. He saw the older couple who came every autumn, still holding hands like they had done for decades. He recognized the weary businessman with the loose tie and haunted eyes, the young woman hesitating at the entrance, as if unsure she truly belonged in a place like this. And he saw the ones who did notice him. A little girl once stopped at the entrance, tugging at her mother's sleeve, her curly hair bouncing as she tilted her head to look up at him. "Mommy, is he a king?" she whispered, her voice brimming with innocent wonder. The mother laughed, embarrassed, tugging the girl away. But Elias had only smiled, tipping his cap. "That might just be the finest compliment I've ever received," he said, his voice warm, steady, like the slow crackle of a fire on a cold evening. She grinned before skipping inside, disappearing into the world beyond the doors. Elias lived for those small moments, the ones that reminded him why he stayed, why he chose this life. Because the Grand Lexington wasn't just a hotel to him, it was his. Not that anyone knew, not that anyone even suspected, and that was just how Elias Moreau wanted it. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over Lexington Heights, bouncing off the sleek glass exterior of the Grand Lexington Hotel. Inside, the lobby was alive with its usual symphony, heels clicking against polished marble, the hum of polite conversations, the distant clatter of silverware from the rooftop restaurant. But today, something in the air felt different, tighter, colder. There was a new presence in the hotel. Elias Moreau, standing at his usual post by the grand revolving doors, had sensed it the moment the man had arrived. Even before he saw him, he felt it. That shift in the atmosphere, the unspoken authority that some men carried like a well-tailored suit. And when he finally laid eyes on him, he knew. Victor Hartman. Tall, broad-shouldered, with hair slicked back so perfectly it looked almost sculpted. He carried himself with the practiced ease of a man who expected the world to move aside for him. His suit was charcoal gray, fitted like a second skin, his watch gleaming beneath the tailored cuff. But it wasn't the expensive fabric or the polished shoes that spoke the loudest. It was his eyes. cold, calculating, the kind of eyes that never truly saw people, only what they could offer. Elias had met men like him before. He had learned long ago that power, when placed in the hands of the wrong kind of man, turned into something ugly. "Who's that?" one of the younger bellhops whispered to another. "The new general manager." Elias didn't react. He just kept his hands folded behind his back, watching as Victor scanned the lobby like a hawk surveying his new territory. His gaze landed briefly on Elias before flicking away without acknowledgement. That was Elias's first warning. For the first week, Victor watched. He moved through the hotel like a man measuring every inch, every detail, looking for flaws. He didn't speak much to the staff, not unless he had to. When he did, it was always direct, sharp, words clipped, void of warmth. He never asked about their routines. He simply corrected them. The front desk attendants, always trained to handle even the most difficult guests with a smile, now tightened their postures whenever Victor passed by. The housekeeping staff, once known for their easy camaraderie, whispered among themselves, glancing over their shoulders. Even the head chef, a man who had worked at the Grand Lexington for over a decade, suddenly found himself re-explaining his methods to someone who had never set foot in a kitchen beyond ordering a 5-star meal. But Elias knew he had already been judged. Victor didn't need to say it out loud. Elias saw it in the way he never acknowledged him, never looked directly at him unless it was necessary, as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture, a relic of an older time that should have been replaced long ago. But Victor wasn't just indifferent, he was impatient. And it didn't take long for that impatience to turn into something worse. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, the sky thick with the promise of rain. The lobby was quieter than usual, save for a few business travelers checking in and a couple of families fresh off a long flight. Elias stood at his usual spot, nodding in greeting as a woman in a navy blue dress stepped inside. She looked tired but offered a polite smile. "Welcome to the Grand Lexington," Elias said warmly, holding the door for her. She paused, just for a second. "It's always nice to hear that from someone who actually sounds like they mean it," she said softly before walking toward the reception desk. Elias chuckled, shaking his head slightly. Moments like these were rare, but they were the reason he stayed. That's when he felt it. The shift in the air. Victor was standing just a few feet away, watching him. Elias straightened, meeting the man's gaze for the first time. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, Victor took a slow step forward, his expression unreadable. "Elias, is it?" Elias nodded. "Yes, sir." Victor exhaled, shaking his head slightly as he looked him up and down. "You've been here a long time." It wasn't a question, it was an observation, laced with something that wasn't quite admiration. Elias didn't flinch. "Yes, sir." Victor tilted his head, as if assessing the weight of those words. Then he let out a quiet chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "You know," he said, voice low enough that only Elias could hear, "there's something to be said about knowing when it's time to step aside." Elias said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Victor studied him for a beat longer before turning away, dismissing him like a man brushing dust off his sleeve. The rain started minutes later, tapping against the grand windows, filling the silence that Victor left behind. And in that silence, Elias knew. The second warning had just been given. The storm rolled in fast, swallowing Lexington Heights under a sky the color of iron. Rain lashed against the glass windows of the Grand Lexington Hotel, streaking down in rivulets, pooling along the sidewalks where taxis lined up, their wipers working furiously. The evening rush had begun, businessmen arriving from late flights, tired couples dragging their luggage through the lobby, bellhops hustling in and out with dripping umbrellas. And through it all, Elias Moreau stood at his post. The rain hadn't touched him. He knew exactly where to stand beneath the brass awning, the same way he knew every creak in the marble floor, every gust of wind that snuck past the heavy doors. He had memorized this building, not just as an employee, but as something far more. "Good evening, ma'am," he greeted a woman stepping out of a town car, quickly offering an umbrella. She took it without a glance, too busy typing into her phone. That was the thing about rain. It made people hurry. It made them impatient. And tonight, there was someone even more impatient than usual. Victor Hartman. Elias saw him before he heard him, striding across the lobby in his perfectly tailored suit, a scowl set deep into his sharp features. He was speaking to someone, but not in a conversational way, in the way a man speaks when he's making sure everyone around him knows he's in charge. "We cannot afford these kinds of mistakes," Victor barked into his phone. "I don't care what the excuse is. Either get it fixed or find a new job." A few employees flinched at the tone. The front desk attendants kept their heads low, fingers moving over keyboards faster than usual. The bellhops, they pretended to be busier than they were, suddenly invested in the placement of luggage carts. Elias, he just kept watching, because something was about to happen, and he wasn't wrong. It started with something small. An elderly woman, maybe in her 70s, walked into the lobby. She wasn't dressed like the usual guests, no designer coat, no gold jewelry clinking at her wrists, just a simple gray shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her short silver hair tucked neatly behind her ears. She paused just inside, her gaze sweeping across the lobby before landing on Elias, and she smiled. "Elias Moreau," she said, her voice warm, familiar in a way that made a few heads turn. "Still here after all these years." Elias blinked, caught off guard for the first time in a long time. He hesitated, searching her face, and then recognition settled in. "Margaret Devereaux," she laughed softly. "You remember?" "Of course, ma'am." He nodded, stepping forward just enough to make their conversation feel like something private, something important. "It's been a long time. A lifetime," she agreed, looking around. "And yet, somehow this place hasn't changed at all." There was something in her voice, nostalgia, affection, a sense of belonging, but their moment didn't last, because that was the moment Victor turned around. He had been in the middle of another frustrated phone call when he noticed them. His frown deepened as he saw Elias standing too close to a guest, his posture not that of a subservient doorman, but of a man engaged in conversation. Victor didn't like that. Not at all. He strode forward, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble, stopping just inches from them. "Is there a problem here?" His voice was sharp, cutting, loud enough that the lobby grew quieter. Elias turned to face him, his face as calm as ever. "Not at all, sir. I was just speaking with—" "That's not your job," Victor interrupted, his eyes narrowing. "Your job is to hold the door, not to chat up the guests." Silence. Margaret's expression shifted, her amusement vanishing in an instant. Victor didn't notice. Or maybe he did, and simply didn't care. "I've let this slide long enough," he continued, his voice rising now, making sure everyone heard. "You're here to serve. You're not here to make friends. You understand that, right?" Elias felt it then, the weight of every gaze in the room pressing against him, the front desk clerks pretending not to listen, the bellhops standing frozen, unsure whether they should step in or step away. Even the guests, who usually never noticed him, were now watching. Humiliation was a strange thing. It didn't burn, it didn't sting. It sank, heavy, deep, like an anchor pulling a man to the bottom of the ocean. And yet, Elias did not break. He simply held Victor's gaze, that same calm, unreadable expression on his face. And then he nodded. "Yes, sir." A flicker of satisfaction crossed Victor's face, as if he had just won something. He turned without another word, walking away, the tension in the room still thick enough to drown in. Margaret exhaled sharply, watching Victor go before turning back to Elias. "What was that?" she asked, her voice tight with barely contained anger. Elias, ever composed, simply gave a small smile. "Nothing, ma'am," he said quietly. "Just a man showing the world who he really is." Margaret held his gaze for a long moment, and then slowly her expression changed. Not anger, not disappointment, determination. She nodded once, almost to herself, and just like that, Elias knew this wasn't over. The rain had stopped, leaving behind streets slick with silver reflections of the Grand Lexington Hotel. Inside, the lobby had returned to its usual rhythm, guests coming and going, the scent of fresh lilies from the grand floral arrangement near the reception desk, the distant hum of a piano from the lounge. But something had shifted. Something unseen, yet undeniable. Elias Moreau stood at his post, just as he had for years, his hands resting lightly behind his back. His posture remained the same, straight, composed, unshaken. Yet beneath the surface, beneath the worn fabric of his uniform, there was a storm of memories. Memories of a time when he wasn't invisible, when he wasn't just the doorman, when this very building, this towering symbol of wealth and prestige, had been his creation. 40 years earlier, the land where the Grand Lexington now stood had once been something very different, a forgotten corner of Lexington Heights, an abandoned structure that most had written off as a lost cause. The city had grown around it, leaving it behind like an old relic, its bricks crumbling, its windows shattered by time. But Elias Moreau? He hadn't seen ruin. He had seen opportunity. He had always been a builder, not just of structures, but of dreams. Born in the deep South, Elias had learned early that the world did not make space for men like him, not easily, not without resistance. But he had worked, he had fought, and he had built his fortune brick by brick, contract by contract, deal by deal. While others had doubted, he had invested in his ideas, in his instincts, in a vision no one else had dared to believe in. And the Grand Lexington? That had been his masterpiece. Not just a hotel, but a statement. A testament to what could be built with grit, intelligence, and a refusal to accept the limitations the world tried to place on him. He had poured everything into it, the best architects, the finest materials, the kind of luxury that made people stop and stare. And when it finally opened, it wasn't just a success, it was a legend. The city's elite had flocked to it, eager to be part of something grand. The name Elias Moreau had carried weight, respect. He had been a man who could shake hands with senators and business moguls and walk into any boardroom knowing he belonged. But wealth, power, success, they could never hold back time. And time? It had stolen the one thing he had never been prepared to lose. Camille, his wife, his heart, his reason. She had been there since the beginning, since before the hotel, before the fortune, when all they had were dreams and each other. She had been the one who saw him not just as the businessman, not just as the visionary, but as the man behind it all. And then one day, she was gone. It had happened so quickly, so cruelly, an illness that neither money nor influence could stop. And when the world took her away, it also took the fire that had burned in Elias's chest for so long. Because what was success, what was wealth, without the person who had made it all worth it? The hotel, once his pride, became a shadow of a memory. He couldn't bear to walk through its halls, couldn't stand to look at the towering glass facade without thinking of her laughter echoing in its rooms. And so one night, as the city lights flickered outside his penthouse window, Elias made a decision. He walked away. He handed over the management, sold the rights to the name, and disappeared from the world he had built. Not completely. No, he stayed close. Not as the owner, not as the powerful man who once stood at the top, but as something simpler, something quieter, a doorman, the one who stood at the entrance, the one who observed, the one who opened the door to others. Because after all these years, that was the part he loved most, the people, their stories, their arrivals, their departures. He no longer needed power, no longer cared for recognition. All he wanted was to be where she had been, to stand at the doors of the place they had built together. And so that's where he stayed. Present day, Elias exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening behind his back. The past never truly left. It lingered, woven into the very walls of the Grand Lexington, in the marble he had once chosen himself, in the chandeliers he had insisted be placed just so. And now he watched men like Victor Hartman walk through his hotel, carrying themselves like kings, believing they owned the air they breathed, the floors they walked on. But they didn't know. They didn't know that the real king had never left. He was still here, watching, waiting. The soft hum of conversation filled the Grand Lexington's grand ballroom, mixing with the gentle clinking of champagne glasses and the occasional burst of polite laughter. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the sea of sharply dressed investors, executives, and socialites who had gathered for one of the hotel's most exclusive events, the annual Investors' Gala. It was the kind of night where fortunes were discussed in hushed tones, where deals were made with a firm handshake and a well-rehearsed smile, a place for the powerful, a place for the entitled. And somewhere in the middle of it all, standing effortlessly among the city's elite, was Margaret Devereaux. She moved with a quiet elegance, her silver hair styled in soft waves, her emerald dress fitting her tall frame with an effortless grace. Margaret had been part of this world for decades, a woman whose name carried just as much weight as the fortunes surrounding her. Her investments stretched across the country, her influence shaping businesses and boardrooms alike. But tonight, she wasn't here for business. She was here for justice. Margaret had spent the past week thinking about that moment in the lobby, about the way Victor Hartman had humiliated Elias, the way he had spoken to him as if he were nothing. And the more she thought about it, the angrier she became. Because Margaret Devereaux knew exactly who Elias Moreau was. She had known him when he was a king. She had sat in meetings with him, watched him build this hotel from the ground up with his own vision, his own brilliance. She had seen his name in gold letters on contracts, had shaken his hand after successful deals. She had witnessed his rise, and she had mourned when he chose to disappear. But he hadn't truly disappeared, had he? No, he had stayed. And now, a man like Victor Hartman had the audacity to belittle him, to treat him as if he were nothing but a relic of the past? No, not tonight. Margaret took a slow sip of her champagne, scanning the room until she found exactly who she was looking for. Victor stood near a group of investors, effortlessly working the room. He was good at it, she'd give him that. His posture was open, his voice smooth, his handshake just firm enough to instill confidence. But she saw through it. She saw the way he spoke with just a little too much authority, how he carefully steered conversations back to himself, how he measured people not by their wisdom or experience, but by how useful they were to him. A man like that, he had no place running a place like this. Margaret set her glass down and walked toward the center of the room, where the hotel's board of directors stood engaged in quiet conversation. "Gentlemen," she greeted, her voice warm, controlled. "I hope you're enjoying the evening." They turned, immediately offering nods and pleasantries, because when Margaret Devereaux spoke, people listened. "Margaret," one of them, a stout man with gray-streaked hair, said, "Always a pleasure. What do you think of the changes under Victor's leadership?" Ah, the perfect opening. Margaret let out a thoughtful hum, letting a brief silence settle before she responded. "I think Victor has certainly made his presence known," she said, her tone unreadable. "But tell me, do any of you actually know the man standing at your front door?" The question hung in the air, catching them off guard. "The doorman," one of them asked, frowning slightly. "Yes," Margaret said simply. "Elias Moreau." A couple of them exchanged glances. "I suppose he's been here for a while," another muttered. Margaret let out a quiet chuckle, a knowing chuckle. "Oh, gentlemen," she said, shaking her head, "you truly don't know, do you?" She turned slightly, just enough to catch Victor in the corner of her vision. He had stopped mid-conversation, his sharp blue eyes locked onto her. He was listening. Good. Margaret took a small step forward, lowering her voice just enough to make them lean in. "Elias Moreau is not just a doorman," she said. "He's not just some old man who happened to stay behind when this place changed hands." She let the silence stretch before delivering the final blow. "He is the true owner of this building." It was as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room. For a moment, there was nothing but the distant sound of jazz floating from the lounge, the faint clinking of glasses as waiters moved through the crowd. Then, murmurs, confusion, shock. The men before her exchanged glances, some frowning, others blinking as if they had misheard. Victor stiffened, his fingers tightening around his drink. "What exactly are you saying?" one of the board members finally asked. Margaret exhaled, offering them a small, knowing smile. "I'm saying that your general manager," she said, tilting her head toward Victor, "humiliated the man who built this hotel with his own hands, the man who still owns the deed to this very building. And not only did he humiliate him, but he did it in the middle of your lobby." The murmurs grew louder. Margaret took a step back, letting the weight of her words sink in. She didn't need to say anything else. She had done what she came to do, and now she would let the truth do the rest. The weight of Margaret Devereaux's words still hung in the air long after they had been spoken. The Grand Lexington's grand ballroom, once alive with effortless chatter, now felt eerily still. Glasses clinked less frequently, conversations turned to hushed whispers, and the air, thick with expensive perfume and champagne, carried an undeniable tension. Somewhere near the bar, a group of investors huddled closer, murmuring among themselves. Near the balcony, a well-known real estate mogul raised an eyebrow, intrigued. A few waiters, usually skilled at fading into the background, lingered just a little longer than usual, ears tuned in. But the one person who did not move was Victor Hartman. He stood like a man who had just been told the walls around him weren't real. Like a man who had spent years believing himself untouchable, only to realize he had been standing on borrowed ground the entire time. Margaret had lit the match. And now, the flames of truth were spreading. The meeting had been called for the following morning, faster than anyone had expected. The board members, shaken by Margaret's revelation, wanted answers, and they wanted them now. And so, at precisely 9 a.m., inside the executive conference room on the 20th floor, the players took their seats. The room was as grand as the rest of the hotel, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the New Haven skyline, a long mahogany table polished to perfection, high-backed leather chairs that had seated some of the most powerful business minds in the city. At the head of the table sat Charles Leland, the chairman of the board, a man who had spent decades ensuring that the Grand Lexington remained one of the most profitable and prestigious hotels in the country. His expression was unreadable, but the way he folded his hands together suggested that he was in no mood for games. To his left sat 3 senior board members, their suits impeccable, their eyes sharp with curiosity, and beneath it all, concern. On the opposite side of the table sat Victor. His usual arrogance had been replaced with something else. Not quite fear. No, Victor Hartman was not a man who scared easily, but an unmistakable tension ran through his shoulders, the slightest tightness in his jaw. He knew. He knew that if he didn't control the narrative, it would be controlled for him. But before he could speak, the doors opened, and Elias Moreau walked in. For a moment, the room felt too small, as if all the air had been pulled into Elias's lungs. He moved with unshaken grace, stepping inside with the quiet confidence of a man who belonged there, even if everyone had forgotten it. Victor's gaze snapped to him immediately, his fingers curling into fists beneath the table. Charles Leland gestured to an empty seat near the end of the table. "Mr. Moreau, please have a seat." Elias nodded once, taking his time, settling into the space as if he had done it 1,000 times before. In a way, he had. Leland adjusted his tie. "Mr. Moreau, I'll be honest with you. We were quite surprised by the information we received last night." Elias only offered a small smile, a knowing smile. "I imagine you were," he said, his voice steady, smooth, like a tide rolling in, unbothered by the storm above. Leland cleared his throat, choosing his words carefully. "Could you clarify for us exactly what your role is in this hotel?" Elias exhaled slowly, watching the room, reading it, measuring it the way a man does when he knows he holds all the power but doesn't need to wield it recklessly. Then, with the quiet authority of a king unveiling a long-kept secret, he spoke. "This hotel," he said, his fingers brushing the smooth surface of the table, "is mine." The words settled into the room like the final click of a lock turning. Victor stiffened. The board members barely blinked, their minds scrambling to process the full weight of what they had just heard. Elias continued, "I built this place from the ground up. Every inch of marble in the lobby, every chandelier hanging in the halls, every brick, I chose them. I placed them." His eyes flickered toward Victor for the briefest second before returning to the rest of the room. "A long time ago," Elias continued, "I made the decision to step away. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I entrusted the management of this hotel to others while I remained close to the place that had once been my dream." He tilted his head slightly, almost amused. "But never, at any point, did I stop owning it." Silence. The kind of silence that weighed 100 pounds. Victor snapped first. "That's..." He let out a breath, forcing a chuckle that didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's an interesting claim, Mr. Moreau, but Elias reached into his coat pocket and, with calm precision, pulled out a single crisp document. He set it on the table, pushing it toward Charles Leland. The chairman lifted it, scanning the paper carefully, his eyes moving over the text. Then, slowly, he placed it back down, looked at Elias, then at Victor. And for the first time since Victor Hartman had entered this hotel, he was powerless, because right there in black and white were the deed records of the Grand Lexington Hotel, and the name on them, Elias Moreau. No one spoke, not for a long, long moment, and then finally Charles Leland cleared his throat. "Well," he straightened, his expression unreadable, "I suppose that settles that. Victor looked as if he had forgotten how to breathe. Elias, however, he simply leaned back in his chair, watching the illusion crumble around the man who had spent the last several weeks treating him like nothing. Because now, the truth was no longer a secret, and everything was about to change. The air inside the executive conference room felt thicker, heavier, as if the very walls of the Grand Lexington were leaning in to witness the moment unfold. Victor Hartman sat rigid in his chair, his body still as stone, except for his jaw, clenched so tightly it looked as if his own teeth might snap under the pressure. Elias Moreau? He remained calm. Not victorious, not smug, just calm. Because he didn't need to gloat, he didn't need to rub salt in the wound. Truth had already done that for him. At the center of the long mahogany table, the document lay undisturbed, the legal proof that Elias was and always had been the rightful owner of the Grand Lexington Hotel. It was a simple truth, a cold, undeniable reality, and yet Victor still fought against it. "Let's be rational," Victor said, his voice cutting through the silence. He was trying to control the conversation, trying to reshape the narrative before it slipped completely from his grasp. This is unexpected, sure, but let's not make any rash decisions." Charles Leland, the board chairman, raised an eyebrow. "Rash decisions?" Victor sat forward, planting his hands on the table as if he could physically hold on to his power. "Look, Elias," Victor said, his voice suddenly straining for politeness. "Mr. Moreau, I respect everything you've done for this hotel, truly, and I think we can both agree that times have changed. Running a hotel now isn't the same as it was decades ago. The business has evolved. It requires modern leadership, strong leadership." Elias didn't react, because he had already seen the cracks in Victor's mask. This wasn't confidence, this wasn't assurance, this was fear, and Victor Hartman was drowning in it. For the first time since he had taken over as general manager, Victor felt the weight of the stares in the room, the board members, the executives, even the assistant standing by the door pretending not to listen. They weren't looking at him like a leader anymore. They were looking at him like a man who had lost control, and he hated it. "Let's be real here," Victor pressed on, his voice lower now, desperate to regain ground. "This hotel has thrived under my leadership. Profits have increased. Occupancy rates are at an all-time high. If we're going to discuss ownership, we should also discuss what's best for the future. And I think," Margaret Devereaux, who had remained silent until now, finally let out a small, amused laugh. Victor's words died in his throat. "Forgive me, Victor," Margaret said, tilting her head slightly, "but do you actually believe that the success of this hotel is because of you?" Victor's eyes snapped to her, his hands curling into fists. Margaret continued, unfazed. "This hotel was already an institution before you even stepped foot inside it," she said. "The Grand Lexington thrived because of its legacy, because of the vision of the man who built it. You simply inherited a machine that was already running." She leaned forward slightly, eyes gleaming. "And remind me, Victor," she said, her voice silky smooth, "what exactly have you contributed, aside from publicly humiliating the very man who made this place possible?" The tension in the room tightened like a noose. Victor's face flushed, with anger, with shame, with the undeniable realization that he had no defense. Charles Leland cleared his throat, tapping a single finger against the table. "I think we've heard enough," he said. Victor turned to him, desperation flashing across his face. "Mr. Leland raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "The Grand Lexington is not just another hotel," Leland said. "It is a symbol of excellence, a place built on legacy and reputation. And while financial success is important, so is the character of the people leading it." His eyes hardened. "And I can't say that I'm particularly impressed with the character you've demonstrated, Victor." Victor's stomach dropped. "Effective immediately," Leland continued, "your tenure as general manager of the Grand Lexington is terminated." The words hit like a gavel striking a courtroom bench. Final. Unavoidable. The end of everything Victor Hartman had built for himself. He stared at them, waiting for someone to object, waiting for an ally to step forward. But no one did. Not the board, not the investors, not a single person in that room. Because he had never built real loyalty. He had ruled with fear, with arrogance, with the illusion of power, and now that illusion had shattered. Victor clenched his jaw, swallowing back the anger, the humiliation. He pushed back his chair too abruptly, the legs screeching against the floor. Then, without another word, he turned and strode toward the door. But just as he reached it, he heard Elias's voice. Calm, steady, unshaken. Victor. Victor froze. For a moment, he considered ignoring him. Just keep walking. Don't give him the satisfaction. But something in Elias's tone demanded respect, even now. So he turned, and when he did, Elias Moreau looked him directly in the eye. No anger, no triumph, just wisdom. Power, Elias said, his voice deep and unwavering, isn't about position. It isn't about title. It isn't even about wealth. Victor swallowed, gripping the brass handle of the door. Elias tilted his head, his gaze unwavering. Power, he said, is about how you treat people when you think you don't need them. Victor's throat tightened, and for the first time in his life he had nothing to say. He turned, pushed open the door, and stepped out of the conference room. And just like that, Victor Hartman was gone. The news spread faster than the morning light creeping through the grand windows of the Grand Lexington Hotel. By the time the clock struck noon, everyone knew. Victor Hartman was gone, dismissed, erased from the halls of power as swiftly as he had once commanded them. His office, which had once been his personal kingdom, was already being emptied. The staff whispered, some in hushed relief, others in quiet awe, as they watched hotel security escort him out through the same grand doors he had so often walked through with arrogance. There was no farewell gathering, no speeches, no one to see him off. Just a hollow silence, the final reminder that he had never truly built respect, only fear. And yet, while Victor's absence left a void in the hotel's leadership, no one was looking at his empty office. They were looking at Elias Moreau. It started small. The bellhops, the same ones who had once only nodded in passing, now stopped to greet him properly. Good morning, Mr. Moreau. The front desk staff, who had long been trained to overlook him, began offering him genuine smiles. Can I get you anything, Mr. Moreau? The waiters in the hotel's five-star restaurant rushed to pull out a chair for him when he passed by for his usual cup of coffee, something they had never done before. But Elias didn't change. He still held the door open. Still greeted guests with that same steady warmth. Still carried himself without arrogance, without expectation. The only difference? Now, people saw him. It wasn't long before Charles Leland, the board chairman, called Elias back up to the executive office. This time it was not to prove his ownership. This time it was to offer him something far greater. You have every right to take back full control of this hotel, Leland said, his voice measured, respectful in a way it should have been from the beginning. To step back into the role you left behind. The other board members, seated around the polished conference table, nodded in agreement. It was the kind of moment many men dreamed of. To reclaim their throne, to sit once again in the chair that had once defined them. But Elias, he only smiled and shook his head. I appreciate the offer, he said, his voice as calm and steady as ever. But I never stepped away because I lost my place. I stepped away because I had already built what I wanted to build. The room fell silent. Elias folded his hands on the table, looking at each of them, as if making sure they truly understood. This hotel doesn't need me at the top, he continued. What it needs is leadership that values more than numbers, more than status. It needs leadership that understands that the heart of this place isn't just the guests, it's the people who keep it running every day. A pause. And then, Margaret Devereaux, who had been sitting quietly watching him with the knowing eyes of an old friend, smiled. Well, she said, leaning back in her chair, if you ask me, that's exactly the kind of wisdom this hotel could use. She turned to Leland. Don't you think? Leland hesitated for only a second before nodding. I do. A decision was made right then and there. Elias Moreau would not return as a businessman. He would return as something greater. A guide, a mentor, a man whose voice would shape the culture of the Grand Lexington, not through power, but through respect. And so, from that day forward, his title was restored, not as CEO, not as chairman, but as honorary director of the Grand Lexington, a man whose presence alone would serve as a reminder of what true leadership looked like. As he stepped out of the office and rode the elevator back down to the lobby, Elias felt nothing but peace. He had no desire for revenge, no need for grandeur. He had already won. Because in the end, the greatest power a man could hold wasn't in his wealth, but in how he carried himself when no one was watching. and Elias Moreau had carried himself well. The first morning without Victor Hartman felt different. Not because of anything obvious. The Grand Lexington Hotel still stood tall in the heart of Lexington Heights, its towering glass windows reflecting the early golden light of New Haven's skyline. The polished marble floors of the lobby still gleamed under the soft glow of the grand chandeliers. The bellhops still hurried to unload luggage, the front desk clerks still smiled as guests checked in, and the scent of fresh coffee still drifted from the lounge. But there was something in the air, something subtle yet undeniable. It was lighter, as if the hotel itself had let out a breath it had been holding for too long. Elias Moreau stood at his usual post, hands lightly clasped behind his back, watching the morning unfold just as he had done for years. But today, when people passed by, they noticed him differently. They greeted him. They met his eyes with something new, not just recognition, but respect. Some of them, the younger bellhops, even seemed shy, as if realizing for the first time that the man they had barely acknowledged was someone far greater than they had ever imagined. One of them, a kid no older than 20, hesitated near the front doors before finally stepping closer. "Mr. Moreau," he said, clearing his throat, I just wanted to say I didn't know about everything, about who you really are." Elias smiled, a knowing smile, a kind smile. "You knew exactly who I was," Elias said simply. "I've been standing right here all along." The kid blinked, taken aback for a second, then grinned. "Yes, sir," he said, standing a little taller before hurrying off to his next task. Elias chuckled softly, shaking his head. He had never needed people to bow to him. He had only ever wanted them to see. The shift in leadership had been swift. With Victor gone, the board wasted no time in making changes. The tense, suffocating pressure that had weighed on the hotel staff for months, gone. The fear of making mistakes, of being scolded, of walking on eggshells, gone. The new general manager, a woman named Amelia Carter, selected under Elias's guidance, brought with her a different kind of leadership. Where Victor had ruled with intimidation, Amelia led with understanding. Where Victor had only cared about numbers, Amelia valued the people behind them. One of the first things she did was something so small, yet so meaningful. She called a meeting with the entire staff. Not in an office, not in a cold, impersonal email. In the ballroom. Everyone was invited. Bellhops, housekeeping, concierge, kitchen staff, front desk workers, everyone. And at the center of the room, standing next to her as an advisor and honored guest, was Elias Moreau. When Amelia spoke, she didn't start with policy changes. She didn't start with numbers. She started with gratitude. "I know that for many of you, the past year has been difficult," she said. "I know that some of you felt unheard, unappreciated, overlooked." She looked around the room, truly seeing them, her voice steady. "But that ends now." A murmur swept through the crowd. Not skepticism, not disbelief, but hope. And then she did something that no one had expected. She turned to Elias and held out a small, polished nameplate. The letters engraved on it were simple, yet profound. Elias Moreau, Honorary Director, a symbol, a reminder, a legacy restored. Elias accepted it with the same steady grace he had carried for his entire life. For a brief moment, the room was silent. Then, applause. Not the forced, polite clapping of a corporate event. Real applause. A thunderous, genuine recognition of the man who had built the very foundation they stood on. The man who had never asked for power, only respect. After the meeting, Elias found himself standing near the grand windows of the ballroom, looking out at the city he had helped shape. Margaret Devereaux approached, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "You always were a stubborn man," she teased. Elias chuckled. "And yet you're still here, putting up with me." Margaret smirked. "Someone has to make sure you don't disappear again." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he exhaled slowly, letting the weight of everything settle. He had spent decades watching from the sidelines, believing that his time had passed, that his role was done. But maybe, just maybe, his story wasn't over yet. The days at the Grand Lexington Hotel moved forward, as they always did. Guests still arrived in sleek black town cars, their luggage wheeled across polished marble floors. The scent of fresh coffee still drifted from the lounge, mixing with the faint perfume of lilies in the grand floral arrangements. The evening jazz band still played softly in the background, and the chandeliers still gleamed like captured stars. But something was different now. The air felt lighter, not just for the employees who no longer carried the silent weight of fear under Victor Hartman's rule, but for the hotel itself, as if the very walls had exhaled, relieved of the burden of arrogance. And at the front entrance, as always, stood Elias Moreau. The only difference? This time, when people passed him, they didn't just walk by, they greeted him by name. "Good morning, Mr. Moreau." "How's your day, Mr. Moreau?" "Sir, do you need anything?" For years, Elias had opened doors for others, expecting nothing in return. Now, for the first time in decades, he could feel something different in the way people looked at him, not as an old man in a uniform, not as a fixture of the hotel, but as someone who had built this place, as someone who had always mattered. One afternoon, as the sun stretched long golden streaks across Lexington Heights, a young employee, a new bellhop, barely in his 20s, approached him, a hesitant look in his eyes. "Mr. Moreau?" Elias turned, offering the same calm, patient smile he always did. "Yes, son?" The kid shifted, rubbing the back of his neck. I was wondering if I could ask you something." Elias nodded, leaning against the brass railing. "Go ahead." The bellhop hesitated, then finally asked, "Why did you do it? I mean, why stay all these years just working the door? You could have lived anywhere, done anything, but you stayed." Elias exhaled, his gaze drifting to the hotel entrance, the revolving doors that had welcomed thousands of people, each with their own stories, their own journeys. "Because power isn't about standing at the top of the ladder," Elias said, his voice steady. "It's about how you carry yourself, no matter where you stand." The kid frowned slightly. "But weren't you mad? I mean, Mr. Hartman treated you like nothing. Didn't that ever—" "Of course it did," Elias admitted. "But what good is anger? Bitterness only eats away at the person who holds on to it." The bellhop was quiet for a moment. Elias smiled, patting the young man's shoulder. "People will forget what you owned, what you built, what you wore." His voice softened. "But they'll never forget how you treated them." The young man nodded slowly, as if letting the words settle deep. Elias didn't need to say anything else. The lesson had already been given. That evening, as the last rays of sunlight melted into the deep blues of twilight, Elias took a slow walk through the hotel's grand halls. He passed the executive offices, where Amelia Carter now sat as general manager, handling business with grace instead of greed. He passed the lobby, where the staff moved with ease instead of fear. He passed the restaurant, where guests dined in warmth, laughter, and comfort, unaware of the history woven into the very foundation beneath their feet. And as he stepped back outside, where the streetlights flickered to life, where the city exhaled the energy of another day ending, he knew. This was enough. He had no desire for power, no hunger for recognition, just the quiet knowledge that he had left something behind that mattered. And in the end, that was the only legacy that truly counted. And that's the incredible story of Elias Moreau, a man who proved that true power isn't about money or status, it's about how we treat others. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this story inspired you as much as it inspired us. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story. And tell me in the comments, what lesson did you take from this story? See you in the next video.